Father, I just ask as we look at Joseph this morning and all the years that he had to wait for you to move, to act, and to reveal. I ask that you would help us to identify the seasons of waiting that we might be in and just help us to be inspired, remembering that all the heroes that we look up to in the Bible all had to wait, usually for long periods of time, for you to reveal, to inform, to change, to act, to do what you do. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Genesis 37. I'm going to look at Joseph, just kind of to intro all of this. Last week we looked at Abraham and all the years he waited for the birth of Isaac, the decisions that he made while he was waiting, good and bad. And to take it a step deeper, to kind of sum this whole thing up last week and what we're going to see this week, is simply this. When we're waiting for God to do something or reveal something, we think it's all about what we're waiting for. What you see in Scripture is this, and I read this in a book many years ago. The book was about waiting. And the man said many times is what God does inside of us while we're waiting is more important than what we're waiting for. What God does inside of us while we're waiting is more important than what we're actually waiting for. And so, with that said, let's plow into the life of Joseph. My assumption is that most of you have probably heard a million sermons on this guy, which means you're very familiar with what I would call the plot line. In other words, his own life, his biography, so to speak. You all know that he was sold by his brothers into slavery. You all know that he ended up in Egypt, and so forth and so on. So with that said, I'm not simply going to sit here and plow through it verse by verse. We're just going to kind of go from main point to main point and see how Joseph waited, see how well he waited, see what happened while he was waiting, and kind of like what Robin was saying, we're going to look at what was going on around him in the lives of the people around him while he was waiting. Because kind of like what she said, the tendency when you're waiting and you're struggling, you really bear down on your own life and you think it's just about you. Scripture never portrays it that way. It's always about you and others. And so, with that said, Genesis 37, and we'll pick it up in verse 1. So Jacob settled again in the land of Canaan, where his father lived as a foreigner. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe, but his brothers hated Joseph because their fathers loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly, my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. His brothers responded, so you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And I hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. Soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. Listen, I've had another dream. The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down before him. And so we're just going to stop right there because I'm sure you're familiar with all of this. But we just want to set the stage here because Joseph had to wait, but this is what led to all this was his family dysfunction. And just as a side note, if you ever think your family is dysfunctional, you need to read the whole book of Genesis. Because starting off with Abraham, all the way to Joseph's death, we have all this family conflict, And if you want to look at a common flaw through the generations, it's all about deception. Abraham lied at a point in time. Isaac lied at a point in time. Jacob was a liar at a point in time. You have a family of liars, which leads to the story of Joseph. Bible quiz. What happens next was, what did his brothers do?
Sold him.
They sold him into slavery, but what did the brothers tell the father? They dipped his robe in blood and they lied to their father about the death of the brother. Tell me, my family is bad, but I don't think I've ever done that. You know, and I bet none of you have either. But going forward, here's what we need to see about waiting. God's sovereignty still works in the most dysfunctional of families. But the problem is, usually some people have to wait. Think about it.
David was saying something.
Pardon?
I'm sorry, when you were talking about dysfunctional family, just tying your sister up to a tree, does that count? Okay.
Who was that? That wasn't you.
Oh, you've heard about it from somebody else.
Yes. So anyway, the stage is set here, right here. We have this family hatred based on, think about it, parental favoritism. For those of you who have multiple siblings, maybe one of your parents had a favorite for whatever reason. So we have all this problem going on, okay? But Joseph gets sold into slavery nonetheless. The brothers lie to the dad, okay? But then what happens next with Joseph? What happens?
Can I just stop here?
Sure.
Because this has always bothered me, and I think is the fact that the Bible doesn't really condemn the father's favoritism, but it is the outcome is because of his favoritism. You know, to me that's wrong that he's favoring this one kid, at least overtly, to the other guys.
Let me put this fashion. All sin is foolishness,
Yeah.
ultimately.
Right.
But lack of wisdom is not necessarily always sinful. We pay the price for our lack of wisdom, do we not?
Yeah.
Okay? But it may not be necessarily black and white sin. In other words, think of it this way. I have 4 kids. I can like one of them better than the other. That in itself is not necessarily wrong. Maybe we have similar temperaments.
Like any of them?
So I may like one of them. However, if I express that, that's foolishness. However, how do those other siblings see my foolishness? They don't say, "Oh, foolish dad." You know what they say? "Bad dad, wrong dad." See what I'm saying?
I do, but I've seen it in reality, and I've seen the results of it.
Yeah, well, yes, and I have too. But all I'm trying to say here is this: all of this has different perspectives to it, and it kind of based on what she said. If you really want to squeeze it for all of its worth, to get the most out of it, and we're going to try to do that today, we have to see all of this not just from Joseph's perspectives, but from all the other players in the game. Follow me? So anyway, going ahead with this, so he gets sold into slavery, and what happens next? Potiphar buys him from the slave traders, right? He ends up in Potiphar's household, chapter 39, okay? Chapter 39, verse 1, when Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So the Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except the kind of food to eat. So, we see God blessing Joseph's life, except for one key thing. He's still basically a slave, is he not? Here's what I want you to see, is that God was blessing things around Joseph, but Joseph was still a slave. What am I saying here? Is that while Joseph is, let's use the word incarcerated, whatever you want to call it, for slavery, while he's blessing what he's doing, he's not improving his own circumstances, is he? He's not miraculously released to go back home, is he? He's still stuck. He's still stuck. What does that tell us? That even you're in the most dire of circumstances, God still ministers through you to others. Why is that important to understand? Because when I'm in dire circumstances, you know what I feel like? I'm weak. I can't control what's going on. And anytime you or me cannot control what's going on, you know how we feel? How does it feel to be powerless? You feel like you can't do anything. No? But what we see here is even though this man is very restricted, he's incarcerated, God sovereignly is still working through him. God's working through you even though God's not fixing things. God's working through you even though he's not fixing things. We think those two ideas go together. They don't.
No, Jimmy, I think sometimes we feel like God ought to come in and make our life perfect. And really, we've got our trials, our tribulations, but yet we're still need to be able to witness to others. So, too many people, I think, get the idea of, okay, I'm a Christian, I'm good, nothing's ever going to bother me again.
Right.
And it's not that way.
Or to put it more precise. Go
When I
ahead.
have my tribulation, I still need to be able to come out and convince or show other people that I love them through the body of Christ.
You know, we always think that if we, hitch our wagon to the Lord, everything will go fine, right? But Jesus said that isn't what's going to happen. You're going to go through trials. You're going to go through tribulation for His name's sake, and that's really kind of a thermometer on if we are living for the Lord, if everything is going great, or if there's a lot of issues and problems. And we just don't like. I got to pull that shade down because it blinds me. Oh, thank you. It hits up the cars.
Yeah. It's like a sun.
Yeah. So anyway, we always think that that's what's happening, and it's when somebody goes to the Lord and they just want the easy road, so they're going to trust the Lord. That's when you need to caution them and say, if you follow Christ, you need to pick up your cross and follow Him. It doesn't make life easier. And because there's a lot of people that have so-called received Christ as their Savior, and they have not really, because they just thought that they were just going to get this wonderful thing, and it's called, I get to go to heaven. Brenda wants to say something.
My daughter, that doesn't believe in anything, has become very attached to a woman who's had a hard time. And it's the old thing about, why does God let so many things happen? I'm not going to believe in Him. I'm not going to. And what they don't realize is that the things that happen that look bad to you are being used for something else. Like that Kirk guy getting killed. Look at what's going on. We didn't want him to get killed right now. But God's using it for the good, I think. I don't think not everything that bad that happens is just something bad that happens. That's what I'm saying.
Well, we live in a cursed world. There's going to be bad. God's not creating the bad. He doesn't send bad to you because He's mean and nasty. nasty, and I know he sometimes he does let Satan have his way with us, and as Job says, but, anyways, I'll quit talking now.
That's okay.
Don't you believe that? I mean, you just have to see the good that comes out of it. It may not even be in your own lifetime.
People
Something's
say,
gonna happen.
people quote Romans 8:28. We know that in all things God works together for good. What it does not say, God causes everything. It says he causes them to work together for something. And there's a difference there. What God is saying there is my sovereignty overrules whatever's going on. I can make it for whatever purpose I want to make it for. You see what I'm saying? But that verse does not promise that God will add this good thing to that good thing to that good thing to equal this good thing.
What I said was so often.
It says God will use, because when you read Romans 8, and I'm sure you're familiar with the passage, when Paul goes past that, what does he say? He talks about all the bad things that can happen. Famine, nakedness, persecution, sword, da-da-da-da-da. If you look at that list that Paul talks about, or that God uses for the good, there's not one good thing in that list. Think about that. He talks about how God causes everything to work together, but then he lists nothing but bad things. Think about that. He does not list prosperity and health in that list. Anyway,
Jim?
side note there. Yeah, go ahead.
Along with that point, when we do become a Christian, when we do decide to follow Jesus, what we're ultimately saying is that we want to be in heaven with Jesus. And we're not gonna get to heaven with Jesus on this earth.
No.
We're gonna have to pass from this earth.
No.
And what is bad is, as far as losing people here on this earth, we ultimately want them to be in heaven with Jesus and everything. So it is truly a blessing.
Mhm.
It's hard to see it at that time and those times,
Mhm.
but ultimately, that's what you're after. You
That's
want
what
to be
you're
with
after.
Jesus, and you're not gonna be here and with Jesus at the same time. It's just
No.
not gonna happen, not in
No.
his plan.
No.
Let's pick up, keep going now where we left off. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, just like me. And Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully.
Say what?
That's for the camera.
That must be in the Greek.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Come and sleep with me, she demanded. This is the first instance in the Bible of a cougar. But Joseph refused. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. One day, however, no one else was around, and he went in to do his work. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, come on, sleep with me. Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. One of the hard things to do when you're waiting is to not get into trouble. Because you know what happens when we wait? We start trying to make life better. Because waiting's difficult, isn't it? And so what we see here with Joseph and his wisdom in waiting is that he could have gotten himself into trouble here, as the story makes very clear. But when you're waiting, here's the thing I've learned. Even if you can't fix things, maybe it's good enough just to not to make them worse. Even if I can't improve things, maybe I can be wise enough not to make it any worse than what it is. How do we make it worse? Because I want something to go the way I want it to go. Notice in this narrative here with Joseph and Potiphar's wife, here's what he doesn't say. Why would I want to sleep with you? You're as ugly as a barn door. He doesn't say that, does he? We don't know how she looked to him. She could have been drop dead gorgeous. After all, if you look at Potiphar, and he's the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard, This man has an office right next to the Oval Office. He's like the Secret Service head. So he's not just a common guy on the street. And let's be honest, in the world's ways, common guys on the street do not always get to marry the Hollywood actress that do that. So anyway, we don't know that, but here's what Joseph doesn't say. He doesn't say, I don't want to. He does not say, I don't want to. What he does say is this: how could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against you, Mrs. Potiphar. No, he doesn't say that. He says this: this is between me and God, not between me and you. That's very important, because when I'm waiting and I get fidgety and I may get angry because I'm having to wait, okay? And let's dig a little deeper. Joseph is a victim, isn't he? In other words, last week when we looked at Abraham's waiting, nobody sinned against Abraham, did they? He just had to wait in the sovereignty of God. This man is here simply because his brothers committed a crime against him, right? Why do I bring that out? Because when life has been unfair to me, I want to balance the scales of justice. When life has been unfair to me, I want to get something that I want. Because when I'm waiting, I'm not getting what I want, am I? And you aren't either. All of that is built into these few short verses. But there's another thing here that Joseph invokes when he talks about God. He acknowledges the sovereignty of God. What he doesn't say to Potiphar's wife is this: you don't understand. My life is so good. Let me tell you what my brothers did. You know what I mean? He doesn't cry on her shoulder. He doesn't cry on her shoulder. He didn't play what I call the victim card. In our society, at least in my lifetime, I don't know if you've observed it, we're all similar in age, we've turned into a society of victims. Mm-hmm. Where every day you have people looking for society to balance the scales of justice. Joseph is a hero. He says, this is between me and God, not between me and society, not between me and Potiphar, not between me and Potiphar's wife. Joseph makes this situation about himself being here in the sovereignty of God in a place he does not want to be, and now he's faced with a temptation he probably doesn't want.
Or he may want, but he can't have.
Well, that's the whole thing. Probably he's conflicted.
It's like the Garden of Eden.
It's like the Garden of Eden.
There's that.
There's
or I want
that.
apple.
Yeah, so that's the thing. He doesn't say, I don't want you, lady. He says it's wrong. But he does not bring his brothers into it. So she keeps doing this, and we all know what happens next, right? Yeah. She cries rape, which is a lie. Obviously, he didn't rape her. Okay? But that's what she does. And so Potiphar puts him in jail, right? This freedom that he had, you might call house arrest, where he's Potiphar's steward, but at least he has some freedom within the household. And even when Joseph says to Potiphar's wife, what does he say? Nobody has more authority than me except Potiphar. You know? In other words, Joseph is enjoying at least a little something here, even though he's been unjustly sold, right? Now he loses that. Why do I bring that out? Just because you wait wisely, your situation may get worse. Think about that. Just because you wait wisely, virtuously, trustfully in the sovereignty of God, don't think God's going to turn around and fix it. God may let it get worse.
And there is something that God did do that Joseph may have realized, is that Potiphar, when he heard this, that she said that Joseph did that, he probably didn't believe his wife. She probably was one of those, but he had to save face. So he had to do something. And the law probably said that he could have Joseph killed.
Yep. Right.
because he owned him as a slave.
Right.
He could do anything he wanted to
Right.
with him.
Right.
So he probably could have killed him,
Yeah.
but I think that he didn't believe her, and so he put him in jail. I think that was also God's sovereignty on top of Joseph's life, to preserve his life even through that, and to say, yes, you did what was right. Here is a blessing. You are safe in jail.
Very well could be. All of this speculation, which I've done, and that is, here's the point. You need to see it the way these people saw it to learn what God is trying to say through it. One more point there in this little episode is this. In verse 10, she kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. This was not a one-shot deal. You know, if you bring a half a gallon of chocolate ice cream in my house, you know, and you say, Jimmy, I'm going to leave it here for 24 hours, and then I'm going to take it away. Okay, this is hard, but I can do anything for 24 hours. That's not the same as you saying, Jimmy, I'm going to leave it here for the next 2 years. You see what I'm saying? It's hard when something comes at you day after day after day. Most of us can muster the willpower for a short period of time. It's hard to muster the willpower for a long period of time. But look at what I call Joseph's wise strategy. It says he kept out of her way as much as possible. 1 Corinthians 10 says, flee immorality. One of the interesting things about immorality in the Bible is that the Bible never advises you to fight it. It advises you to run from it. Joseph had a very wise strategy. He did the best he could do. He did not follow this woman around the house every day. When she went this way, he went that way. When she went this way, he went that way. What does that say about Joseph?
He knows he could be tempted.
He knows he could fall. The man is wise enough, as Clint Eastwood said in Dirty Harry, a man's got to know his limitations. So Joseph knew his limitations, and he took Clint Eastwood's advice, and he went the other way. One of the smartest things you can do when you're being tested by having to wait is to look in the mirror and take an honest assessment of who am I? What is my temperament? What is my gender? What is my age? What is my environment? In other words, waiting we tend to think of as something that you do very passively. In Scripture, waiting you do actively. Not that you do something, but you learn something. You don't just learn something about God in waiting, you learn about yourself. And Joseph very wisely concocted the best strategy he could with the options that he had to try to conquer this temptation. But he was thrown into prison. Chapter 40, Genesis 40. So, 40 verse 1. Sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph. I'll just stop there and start summarizing the rest of the chapter. Once again, Joseph proves himself to be an able administrator, not just in Potiphar's household, but in prison with these two prisoners. And that gets noticed. Why do I bring that up? Because once again, God is blessing Joseph's ministry, but he's not improving Joseph's life. While Joseph is waiting in prison, stuck there, a victim, unjustly treated by his brothers, unjustly treated by Potiphar's wife and Potiphar. Think about that. If any man now has the right to play the victim card, it's him. No? But he doesn't play the victim card. He still uses his God-given abilities to do what he can do even in prison with these two prisoners. I don't know about you, but after those two strikes between the brothers and Potiphar's wife, I'd be getting pretty bitter. And you know what would be the last thing that would be on my mind? Doing anything for anybody else. But Joseph looks out for these two strangers that up to this point he did not even know. He looks out for these two strangers he does not even know, and he does what he can do for them. And so they each have their dream. Genesis 40, pick up with me in verse 8. They replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." "Interpreting dreams is God's business," Joseph replied. "Go ahead and tell me your dreams." What do we see in that answer? We see in this answer basically the same thing we saw in his answer to Potiphar's wife. This man once again shows his belief in the sovereignty of God. Think about that. Under the most dire circumstances, after his life just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, he still clings to his belief in the sovereignty of God. If I was in a dirty, nasty prison, because these are not American prisons, right, where you get 3 meals a day and movies in the gym. This is, back then, back that place. If I was stuck there and these two strangers started belly aching about their problems, I'd tell them to shut up. But Joseph says, "No, maybe I can help you. Tell me. Maybe God will answer this." And so he interprets their dreams. And to summarize it all, the cupbearer has a great dream because his dream indicates that Pharaoh is going to restore him to his position in the royal court at the king's elbow as the cupbearer. Okay? The baker, his dream indicates that he's going to be executed pretty soon. Joseph basically tells him that, and he minces no words. Once again, what does that tell us about Joseph? That when Joseph has to tell people good news from God, he's going to tell them. When he has to tell them bad news from God, he's going to tell them. This is Joseph being a preacher in our day who preaches on heaven one Sunday and on hell the next. He gives the people the news that God wants them to hear, not what he would like to tell them just to get out of the situation. But what's underneath that news? That God has made this choice because God's sovereign. God has made this choice because God is sovereign. In other words, when you're waiting and you're having trouble trusting in the love of God, you cling to the sovereignty of God. When your life just keeps getting worse, the longer you wait, and not better the longer you wait, and when you may have waited well with your temptations, kudos for you. You get a gold star. You may have done it all perfectly well, perfectly biblical, but life just keeps getting worse into the sewer. Joseph still clings to the sovereignty of God. And no matter how miserable his life is, he's willing to minister in the opportunities that God gives him. So, he gives the interpretation of the dreams, okay? Pick up with me in Genesis 40, verse 18. This is what the dream means, Joseph told him. 3 baskets also represent 3 days. 3 days from now, Pharaoh will lift you up and impale your body on a pole. Think about that one. Then birds will come and peck away your flesh. Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later. He prepared a banquet for all of his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But Pharaoh impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted his dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. That last verse is important because you need to back up to verse 14. And let's read what Joseph says in verse 14. Please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I am here in prison, and I did nothing to deserve it. So, that's Joseph's perspective. Joseph does not gloss over what is done. He knows he's basically a victim. He's been unjustly treated all along the way. And now he's simply asking this guy to put in a good word for him. Now go to chapter 41 and let's see what happened. 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. Then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up. Skip with me down to verse 8. The next morning, Pharaoh was disturbed by his dreams, so he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. When Pharaoh told them his dreams, not one of them could tell him what they meant. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Today I've been reminded of my failure, he told Pharaoh. Some time ago you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night the chief baker and I each had a dream. Each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told each of us what our dreams meant. The reason I'm highlighting this passage goes back to the very first verse of chapter 41. What does it say there? 2 full years later. So, we know Joseph was in prison before this verse. So we know he's been in prison for at least 2 years, right? But why do I bring that out? Because this man, even though he does all the right things, he's still stuck there for 2 years. In other words, let's put it a different way. He did the right thing while he was waiting, but did God snap his fingers and end the waiting period?
No. Are you going to bring up Psalm 105, verse 19?
Go ahead.
It says, until the time came to fulfill his dreams, the Lord tested Joseph's character. Then Pharaoh sent for him and set him free. The ruler of the nation opened his prison door. It goes on about Joseph right there. But anyway,
Yeah.
the time had to be fulfilled for his dream, Joseph's dream, from back when he dreamed that his family was going to bow down to him.
Uh-huh.
That time period had to come to when it was going to be the drought and he was going to interpret Pharaoh's dream.
Right. And I don't know if you heard, but the key phrase in there, God was testing Joseph's character.
Yes.
Waiting is a test. We have to decide if we're going to wait wisely or foolishly. Are we going to try to fix it? Are we going to accept it? Are we going to minister while we're waiting, even though we're miserable waiting, even though we might be waiting unjustly? But Joseph keeps clinging to the sovereignty of God. So, he had his original dream when he was 17, right? So at this point, we know that he's at least 19. He very well could be like 20 or 21. The narrative doesn't make it clear, but we know it's been at least 2 years this has been going on. Follow me? If I had to wait 2 years for something now that I'm 70, I can tell you this about me. I do it a dang sight better than I would have done at 19. I don't know how long my patience is now, but compared to what it was then, it's this big. Joseph had one of the hardest things for a young man to do when he was youngest. What do I mean by that? I'm having to wait, and I had this good-looking cougar in front of me. Can you think of a worse thing for a 19-year-old to be faced with? What do I mean by that? Sometimes when you're waiting your best, God allows you to face your hardest temptations. If the waiting itself is not bad enough, the temptation makes it even worse. So that's where he is. 2 years have come by. Pharaoh has his dream of the 7 fat cows, 7 skinny cows. He brings Joseph out of prison to talk about it. Chapter 41, verse 14. 41:14. Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once. He was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I've heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. It is beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied. But God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. What do you see here? When he was confronted with Potiphar's wife, he made a statement about the sovereignty of God. When he was confronted with the dreams of the prisoners, he made a statement about the sovereignty of God. When he was confronted with Pharaoh's dream, he made a statement about the sovereignty of God. And each of those 3 things, what did he do? He made a statement about the sovereignty of God, not about how miserable he was waiting. He made a statement about the sovereignty of God. He didn't immediately tell Pharaoh, you don't understand, Pharaoh. Let me tell you about my brothers. None of that. Instead of telling Pharaoh about his own troubles, he pointed to the sovereignty of God. He pointed to not to how bad his situation was. You know what he pointed to? What he couldn't do. Think about that. He didn't talk about how bad his situation was. He pointed to what he could not do, but what God could do. That's very important when you're waiting. You keep in mind what you can't do, and you keep in mind what God can do. And so he does that. He interprets the dreams. I'm sure you're familiar with the story on how that goes. So, what happens there? Let's turn the page. Chapter 41. Let's pick it up in verse 37. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials, so Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of his dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or as wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all of my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand, placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. And we'll just stop there, because here's what I want you to see. You remember what I said? When you're waiting, it's never just about you. Let's look at these other characters. Joseph waiting made him cross paths with Potiphar, with Potiphar's wife. Potiphar saw how well Joseph was as administrator. Okay? There was a deal with Potiphar's wife. There was a deal with the cupbearer and the baker, right? And now there's Pharaoh. In other words, from Joseph's point of view, he's just basically still stuck here. The vision that he had at 17, it's been a long time ago by now, okay? But yet in his waiting, there's all this stuff going on around him, where what's happening between God and these people? Did God try to reveal himself to Potiphar and Potiphar's wife through Joseph?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Did God try to reveal himself to the cupbearer and the baker? Yes. Now, in Pharaoh's own words, Pharaoh says, I see that God's with you. Here's why that's important. Egyptians were thoroughly polytheistic. They had thousands of gods for different things. But what you see here is that by what God is doing miraculously through Joseph, is trying to tell Pharaoh, Joseph's God is better than your God. What your God and your people, because remember Pharaoh's wise men could not interpret the dream, right? So through Joseph's incarceration, unjust that it was, 2 years that it lasted, God is communicating to this Pharaoh that Joseph's God is better than your God. Pay attention. Did Joseph design any of this?
No.
Would Joseph have chosen any of this?
No.
No. But Joseph accepted it. And at each juncture, when he had to make a crucial decision, he appealed not to the love of God. He didn't even appeal to the Abrahamic covenant, which is a big deal for them. What did he appeal to? The sovereignty of God. God can do this. God can do this. God can do this. When I'm waiting for long periods of time, it's hard for me to believe God can do anything. Because you know why? When you're waiting, you think nothing's happening.
I think it's interesting that he's a slave. I've been listening. The only reason I bring this out, I've been listening to a book about ancient Rome, and this
Right.
was sort of told in the point of view of these different characters. And they're slaves.
Mhm.
They have no, they sort of accept their circumstances because that's it.
Right.
They have no control over it. And
Right.
so Joseph already knows, hey, I can't do anything.
I
It's
can't
only
do
through,
anything.
but he is a Hebrew, so he does have that advantage.
Yes.
Knowing that there is God. in his
Yes.
life.
Yes, he does. He does. And each time he's challenged with it, he demonstrates it.
And I wanted to bring out a couple of things, because you read the verse.
Okay?
Pharaoh gave him his signet ring. That meant that he could sign all documents. And he had the power to do, set the.
He had
any
authority.
rule-
Yes.
Any rule in
Yes.
place.
He had authority.
Also, the gold chain represents that every time that a person saw the gold chain on their neck, they were to bow down.
Mhm.
So here he is, he's in the chariot, he's going through town, and everybody's yelling, they're yelling, bow down to him, he's the new second in command, da 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 da, and he's got the gold chain. Guess who was probably there and saw it? Mrs. Potiphar, right there. And he could have said, nanner, nanner.
Yes. Yes. Or he could have gone back to Potiphar himself. Now you'll be the man, you'll be my servant.
Yeah.
No, you're right. Any of those things could have happened.
Right.
So,
But knowing Joseph, he didn't do any of that.
let's see, what do we do next? 41:46. We'll pick it up in verse 40. What is that? Yeah, 46. 41:46. He, speaking about Joseph, was 30 years old when he began serving in the court of Pharaoh. Let's do the math. We know that he's been in prison for 2 years, at least. Okay? How old was he at the beginning of the story when he first had the dream from God? He was 17. Now he's 30. How many years have gone by? 13 years. That's a long time to wait. 13 years is a long time to wait, especially during those intervening 13 years when life just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. But now he's 30 years old, serving the king, okay? And the rest of chapter 41 basically talks about what's happening with the cows. They have their 7 good years, okay? And then they have their 7 famine years that have set in. And in chapter 42, What happens there? You remember what happens with the brothers? They end up going to Egypt looking for food, right? The famine is hit everybody, and they've gone to Egypt looking for food. Let's see, chapter 45. Skip way over to chapter 45. And we're going to read here about the reunion of Joseph and his brothers. Chapter 45, verse 3. Joseph and his brothers are face to face. I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. Please come closer, he said to them. So they came closer. He said again, I'm Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery. But don't be upset. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here and not you, and he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. I'm going to read that again because we need to look at all of this repetition. So, when they came closer, the first thing he says in verse 5, it was God who sent me here ahead of you. Verse 7, God has sent me ahead of you. The next verse 8, it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me advisor. He doesn't say Pharaoh made him an advisor. He said God did. Why do I repeat that? Over and over and over through this narrative, Joseph repeatedly appeals to the sovereignty of God. He does not say the final decisions in my life rest with my brothers. The final decision in my life does not rest with Potiphar. The final decisions in my life do not rest with the baker or the cupbearer. The final decisions in my life does not rest with Pharaoh. In other words, if you look at the social spectrum here, from his common everyday brothers who were scoundrels to the most powerful man in the civilized world at that point, and everybody in between, Joseph said, every time what happens to me with these people is under the hand of the sovereignty of God. So, whether it's me in my life, me and you, me and the sheriff of Citrus County, the governor of Florida, or Donald Trump, the final decisions in my life rest with the sovereignty of God. And that's what makes you a good waiter.
Jimmy, I never noticed verse 50, chapter 41.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph had 2 sons by Potiphar's daughter.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Good point. Say that again. Say that again.
What's that, what verse was it?
41:50. He had 2 sons by Potiphar's daughter.
God has the final say so.
I don't think that's Potiphar.
Different Potiphar?
It's Potipharah, the priest of On.
Oh.
Sorry,
Well, go ahead.
bust your
Go ahead.
bubble.
You got it.
No, so what he did is this is a pagan, this is a high pagan man that serves On, whatever On is. On is a god. It's capital O.
Right.
And that it's a little g god, capital O. So that's the name of the god. And this guy is, the word is very similar, but it's not Potiphar. And so he is married to the daughter of the high worshiper of this little g god. So that is even harder for us to wrap our mind around. That would be equated to if one of my children, or one of his children, married, somebody that their dad was a Satanist.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Go
My
ahead.
Bible note says Potiphar was a priest of On, the center of worship for the sun god. And so, anyway, that's what
Yeah.
the thing just said.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm
Like-
sorry I distracted from the.
That's okay.
No, that's good. But see,
You're
you
trying
brought
to
that-
take it.
You brought that up so that we could talk about how Joseph keeps getting injustices piled on him, and, you know, where he has to choose. Okay, so now I'm married to this woman, but it's gonna be gone in our home. So,
One more point to bring out, okay? In Joseph's reunion here, 45, verse 6. Chapter 45, verse 6. Joseph's talking, this famine has ravaged the land for 2 years, it will last 5 more years. We need to do a little more math. He came to power when he was 30, right? Then we had 7 good years, which gets him to 37. Then the famine kicks in. The famine's been going on for 2 years. So how old is he now? 39, right? Once again, what's 39 minus 17? 22 years. It took 22 years for this timetable to unfold and get to this point. 22 years for this to happen. To me, that's a long wait.
Not anymore.
I don't have 22 years.
Once again, though, if you start out at 17,
Yeah,
22
there you
years.
go.
Years. But what you need to see here is this. Joseph's waiting concerned a lot more people than just Joseph. And like what I said at the beginning, when you're waiting, just remember it's not just always about